Okay, so this week we're going to prove God's existence about 4 times in completely different and fun ways. We were supposed to do this last week. And one thing that I like to do in my syllabi is to give you guys an extra week so that you are not taking the final for this class if you choose to take it during the rest of your finals. Which means that I end class a week early and then assign the final during like what's dead week or reading week, whatever you call it here. But because we canceled class last week and I have like the lectures, I can reschedule that lecture to like fill in and get the rest of the course content done. Would you guys want to have an extra week of class? You would? Like if people want to show up, I'll have it because I'm happy to do it. There's fun content. But you know, if nobody's interested, then what do you guys think online? Would you come to an extra week? Yeah. Okay.
I would. I wouldn't mind.
Well, great. So that's enough. I'll edit the syllabus then and push everything back. So I'll even do this. I will edit the final exam so that it opens on the same day, so you can choose to take it early should you want to do that, and then it'll just give you like an extra week to take it. So I won't change the final beginning date, but I'll just add an extra lecture on top of it. So then functionally it's just the same for your finals planning and stress levels and stuff. Like I was like that when I was a student, was having my finals sort of tiered, you know, where I didn't have to study for 4 tests Monday to Wednesday in a single week. That just felt absurd. And I felt like I didn't really learn all that much. I was just cramming. Anyways, we'll do that and I'll edit the syllabus probably sometime this weekend. So be on the lookout for that. It'll really just, so how I do it, I suppose, will be kind of interesting too. Maybe we can have a little feedback here as well. The lectures that are left are the one for the William Rowe reading, which is arguments for atheism and against atheism. So the idea of like theodicy, which is contending with the problem of evil. How can you have the existence of an all-perfect God if there's evil in the world? And then like the atheist thrust of that argument, and then the theist response to it. So a bit of like back and forth debate, which I think fits naturally after this lecture, but it would come at the cost of doing our flow state lecture before the like dance philosophy lesson that I've planned. So would you like to have, before I have like the dance professor come into our classroom, some philosophical background on embodiment and like inactivism, meaning like cognition and perception and even knowledge, like being a part of our physical body and how we interact with the world rather than just mental states? Or would you rather finish up the unit on philosophy of religion? Do you guys have preferences?
The first one.
You'd rather have that come first?
What was the first one?
So we would do flow states and then dance and then finish fill religion at the end, or we finish fill religion and then just go straight into dance and then do flow states after?
Religion first.
Okay, so finish this unit. Okay, cool. So that's what we'll do next week then. As I edit the schedule, we will do the William Rowe reading, and then we'll jump into our embodiment, flow state, cognition stuff. That's what I work on. So it'll be fun. Cool. Well then, without any further ado, let's prove the existence of God. Okay, so before I begin, I want to make a disclaimer, which is that we should make a distinction between the God of the philosophers and the God of the theologians. So if you are a person of faith, the kind of God that we're talking about today may not sound like, be recognizable, feel like even the God that you are used to or even have faith in. And that's because there's a distinction between these two things, at least as I see it. This is my own thinking on the subject. As far as I know, it's not like in the phil religion literature. But the idea is that the God of the philosophers is a God who's proven through reason as opposed to written and experienced testament, right? So the God that you find in the Bible is a God who has a certain narrative power, right? It's a God that appears like us, not as us, but like we are made in the image of, right? And we're given both metaphor and story and narrative to understand who this God is. Whereas the God of the philosophers, in being proven through reason rather than like religious experience and testament, is something that's theoretical. It's not a God that exists because of the tradition brought down through the covenant made with Abraham, right? It's instead a God that is we are committed to, given these arguments, by our rational capacity, as these thinkers would have it. So what the general strategy of Anselm, Aquinas, Paley, not so much Pascal, who we'll see at the end, who does a very different kind of probability-based argument for God's existence, is that their strategies are not theological or like religious, that they're philosophical. They're using arguments and they're saying, look, I can show that we are committed by reason to the existence of X kind of being, which accords with my faith in the Y kind of being, which is the God of the church that I've been taught. Say like, look, there's this correspondence, and isn't that great? Doesn't this make our faith all that much stronger? Now, this is not always well received, depending on what, if you're Christian, say, because that's also the God that we're going to be focusing on, at least the Abrahamic God. So it could sort of work for Judaism and Muslim as well. But if you are of certain varieties of Abrahamic tradition, you may find yourself thinking, well, this is just absurd, right? And if you feel this way, this is like totally fine and valid and good. But I would urge you to change how you're thinking about the issue then. Just like forget that it's about the God that you believe in and think about the quality of the arguments themselves. And that's what I love about this lecture in particular, and like this topic is proofs for God's existence, is that you get such simple, elegant, small, beautiful proofs, just easy arguments that give you supposedly, like the existence of the supreme being. It's fun to me, but I'm coming from the inside, so we'll see what you guys think. But some other distinctions, right, is that the God of the theologians is like sort of the end of faith. You have faith, and that is your sustenance for belief, whereas these proofs would have it be the conclusion of an argument, and it's reason, which is the sustenance for belief. And I'm not sure that Anselm or Aquinas or anyone who gives these kinds of proofs for God would be satisfied alone by their rational proofs, but it helps, like to say, like, look, I'm not just without reason. I'm not baselessly thinking this. Okay, so that's just like hedge, right? So let's get to it. There are three classical forms of proof for God's existence. There's the cosmological proof, which turns out to be deductive. It's also theoretical, so you don't have to like look at the world, really, sort of you do, but it's mostly a priori. It's in your head. You can just like think to the conclusion. It's not based on evidence. Same thing with the ontological proof. It's also deductive, so it doesn't have to do with probabilities or chance. It is just like, given the law of reason itself, the way that I put together these premises, so I purport, says these arguments, God exists. And these two forms of proof are to be contrasted with the teleological form of proof, which is probabilistic. It's inductive, and empirical. So it proves God's existence based on evidence and the way that the world is sort of composed and how it all fits together. And then Pascal does not so much prove his bet on God's existence. So we're going to start with the deductive and more theoretical side of proofs before we move into our probability-based theories. So my favorite argument of all time in all of philosophy is Anselm's ontological proof, because it's so simple. You need like 2 steps, but I've broken it down so it's a little clearer how it works, but it's lovely. So Saint Anselm here with his big fancy hat is an awesome thinker of the antiquity, who helps throughout the ages. Christianity, the Catholic Church specifically, has had these moments where they decide what their dogma and doctrine should be, what books to accept, what beliefs to follow, how to understand the Holy Trinity, etc. St. Anselm is at one of the first of these, and is an incredibly important figure in the church generally, and also for like philosophy and thinking generally. But the ontological proof, which is his proof for God's existence, comes to us from the Greek word ontos for being, and logos for reason. So like the principle of being is going to be sort of like the spirit with which God is proven here. So premise 1, God is the being than whom nothing greater can be conceived. God exists as an idea in the mind. So like I can conceive of God in my head, like I can think about God, right? So a being that exists in the mind and in reality is greater than a being that only exists in the mind. Right? And here's the reason for thinking this. If I can imagine a perfect, all-powerful being who has the ability to allow all living creatures to realize the beatific vision in the perfect harmony of heaven or whatever, and that being doesn't exist, well, then I can imagine something a little better, right? I can imagine one that's just like that and also exists, right? Because it would be better if that being existed, because then you presume that they would actually like help you realize the beatific vision. So it's greater that this being that we're conceiving of exists in reality than not. So from 2 and 3, if God only exists in the mind, then we can imagine something greater than God. But given premise 1, we can't imagine anything greater than God, because God is defined as that than whom no greater can be conceived. Therefore, God exists not only in the mind, but also in reality. And if you take an advanced logic course, you don't try to understand, you won't understand it. But if you take a modal logic course, this is a modal logic proof that is ontological in nature. It comes to us from Alvin Plantinga in his book, Nature and Necessity. I think it's Nature and Necessity. He's a contemporary philosopher who's still alive, and using the strongest system of modal logic, S5 modal logic, shows that the existence of God must be, and it's just like another form of this proof. So just to show you like how it's deductive, and that given the rules of logic and inference, like God's existence falls out. So does God exist? That's not a rhetorical question. I just proved God at you. Are we convinced?
Can we imagine something greater than God, though?
Can you imagine something greater than God? Follow through. Keep going with the thought.
Like, so if God, as we determine it to be, is, all powerful and all being, we could say that there is a God of a God, right? Something that can control the God that is all powerful and all being, right?
Mm-hmm.
So therefore we could imagine something more powerful than God.
Good. Okay. So this is a form of a denial of, look at that. I had the slide ready to go. This is a form of the denial of premise 1. So the idea here being that we're saying that God is that than whom no greater can be conceived, but why can't I think of another being that isn't God that is greater than whom no other can be conceived, right? So a God of gods, or in the case of Bishop Guanillo, the perfect island. And this is a famous objection, so very good. The perfect island objection goes like this. I can imagine the island greater than which no other can be conceived. It's the perfect place to vacation, and I already own property there that's like tripled in value. It's the perfect island, right? And it has just enough palm trees to give me shade and just enough fish to keep me occupied, like whatever, right? So I can imagine this island existing, and it would be better if it actually existed than if it just was an idea in my mind. Therefore, given this proof, my perfect island exists. What do we think of this objection? So as Anselm or a defender of the ontological proof, does anybody have any intuitions about how you might respond to Guanillo's perfect island objection, the denial of premise one? No. Shaking heads. Yeah.
This
Rachel.
is kind of weak, so I feel like this is a mid take, but if God is greater than anything that can be conceived, then God can't be in the mind because it could never be conceived enough to be in the mind.
Oh. Well, that doesn't answer my question, but it does get to my next slide. So very good. And it's not a mid take, it's Hume's. Unless you're like throwing shade at Hume, which we'll have problems after class. So here's the response classically to Guanillo's perfect island: is what you call God, or sorry, what you call the perfect island, I call God, and it may go by many names, but there is only one maximally great being. There's only one maximally perfect being, and if it is conceived of as an island or some floaty beardy man in the sky, like whatever, at the limit, right, at this point, you can't have multiple beings greater than which no other can be conceived. It is a single, it is a domain within which only a single object can fit, right? So the perfect island, the perfect unicorn, the perfect, who the heck knows, right? God is the only being that satisfies that criterion. So this is how you might respond to Guanillo's objection. So to Rachel's objection, we could deny premise two, that God exists as an idea in the mind, right? So the way you did it was interesting. It was different from Hume, but of a similar sort of spirit. So what you suggested was that God is the being greater than whom no other can be conceived. This sort of assumes that we can conceive of God, but I can also maybe controversially imagine things that I can't imagine, right? So in social political theory, there's two, at least, the forms of ignorance. There's ignorance and there's meta-ignorance. Okay, so what we are ignorant of might be the fact that we think that because you have white skin, that makes you the superior human or whatever, right? This is just ignorance, right? It's just a prejudice, and it's just ignorance and just prejudice in that you're culpable for that belief. It leads to bad things, and it's a bad belief. It's poorly formed, and you have every good reason to not have that belief. There's nothing stopping you from having the contents of mind that should allow you to think better, right? To be a better thinker and not be prejudiced, right? So ignorance is when you have a belief and you have all of the tools also available to you to not have such a shitty belief, right? Meta-ignorance, however, is something different. So think underground cult member, right, has no idea that like they've grown up in a box underground and have been taught that, I don't know, like the air is poison and the ground is lava or whatever. And then all of a sudden, like you let them up and they're holding their breath for like a minute, they finally breathe and like, oh my God, I can breathe, right? The moment before they breathe is meta-ignorance. They have no ability to know that the air isn't poison. They have no evidence. There's no way that they could even conceive of an alternative, because it's just not information that was ever available to them. It's still kind of ignorance because the air isn't poison, right? But it's not the sort of ignorance that you might be culpable of, right? So in this manner of speaking, we might also think that that God being a supreme tri-omni-perfect being, tri-omni being omnipotent, all-powerful, omniscient, all-knowing, and omnibenevolent, all good. So the idea is that this God has all of the power to realize any possible state of affairs, knows all of the possible states of affairs, is all-knowing, and is omnibenevolent, all good, and so will always choose the best of all possible outcomes. So you get Leibniz's famous claim that God created the best of all possible worlds, which Voltaire makes fun of in Candide. Anyways, we might think that this sort of tri-omni perfect being is something beyond conception, right? And I can recognize, at least in a meta-ignorant sort of way, that there's stuff out there that I don't know, right? And that I just can't know. And if I need to have an idea of this God in my mind, then for the proof to work, and God is sort of beyond conception, then the proof just doesn't work, right? There might be other reasons to think that God exists, but this proof just does not do it. Hume gives us a similar objection, similar in spirit, sort of like objection parallel, where he says, look, so remember Hume with like personal identity said, all I get is impressions at any one given time. I never see myself through it all. The idea being that as the super hardcore empiricist, he only has datum, single individual points, and there's no like causal connection that he can see between all of them because he only has single data points, right? So similarly, if minds are only able to conceive of finite things and God is supposed to be an infinite thing, then we just can't conceive of God. So premise one is not like false, but psychologically impossible. So it may be logically possible if you had the mind of a God or whatever, but it is not a psychologically possible thing to conceive of that than whom no greater can be conceived. Good. Does anybody else want to try to object to the ontological proof? I have one more like formal objection slide prepared, but I promise you won't get it because it's kind of weird. But there are other fun objections to
I kind of have one.
Great.
So it sort of relates to the idea of like infinity, but like if the universe is like infinite, then could there be like there could always be another greater sort of being, like just an infinite set of greater beings, and then infinite is endless, so there is no highest power.
This is cool. I like this idea. So how do I go with this? Yeah, so what the proof relies upon with the idea of infinity is that the infinite is maximally infinite, but it turns out that infinity operates in what are called like cardinalities. There are greater and lesser infinities, which was discovered mathematically by this guy Eric Cantor, Cantor, and his diagonalization proof, which is dope. It's so cool. So the idea is that you can prove that, well, anyways, you should look up the diagonalization proof because it's really fun. It's kind of easy. There's a bunch of YouTube videos about it, I'm sure, that would.
Fun fact, alpha null is the smallest infinity.
Yeah, so here's the idea, is that what this proof requires is that there's a maximum, like an infinity, and God is that thing, and it's like the one. But if infinities can grow and grow and grow and grow and like become more like larger cardinalities, infinity, bigger infinities, then it's like is it turtles all the way up, right? We talked about turtles all the way down. Like this seems like turtles all the way up. Which one of them is God, right? And you can't really point to the right one. Really cool objection. I haven't heard this before. So what Cantor does is he says, look, there's what's it called? Numeric. I think it's numeric infinity. Don't quote me on that. That might be wrong. It's been a long time since I thought about this. But the idea is that for every integer you can just have like a one-to-one relation with another set of objects that's infinite. So like, if you have the set of all integers divided by 2 and then doubled, that would still equal the set of just integers, even though like you're doubling it and like having, whatever, because you can just draw a one-to-one relation that would go on infinitely. But with the diagonalization proof, we can see that there are sets of infinities that end up not being able to have that one-to-one relation. So they're bigger infinities. And the whole religious community goes crazy and they kind of excommunicate, ostracize Cantor, because what he's done is given a mathematical proof that was like no good. It was a mathematical proof that broke this idea that that God is the infinite, right? The maximality of conception and of existence, right? But if infinities keep growing, then God can't just be that thing. Eric Cantor, however, in Personal Letters, wrote that he thought that this was just like a greater expression of God's infinite greatness, right? That God is not even limited by infinity. And so in having this proof of bigger and infinitely expanding greater infinities, that this was sort of like a testament of faith for him. So it's both a mathematically interesting moment in history and a religiously interesting moment. But yeah, you're absolutely right, Tim, that this proof requires a singular idea of infinity, and if we lose that, then we might also lose the proof. Now, there might be something fun to be said to reconceive of the first premise in light of cardinalities of infinity, but it would take some semantic jujitsu to get that done. So interesting, good objection. It's fun. Anybody else before we do the next one? No. How about this one? This is kind of like a fun one that sometimes students bring up, is that by the form and logic of this proof, shouldn't it also prove the being that than whom no worse can be conceived? Right? The existence of like a perfectly evil, maleficent, terrible being must exist, because it'd be much worse for that being to exist in reality than just in the mind. It's kind of spooky, huh? Yeah. Okay, so the other famous classical historical objection to this proof comes from Kant, which says, like, look, existence isn't a property. It's not a thing that you can have or not. Existence is a predicate, or like a quality for which you can predicate certain other properties of objects. So the book exists, and the book is rectangular and red and it has paper. Its existence is not a property like redness or like rectangularness or like having paperness. It's sort of like the container predicate. It's the thing that allows you to like predicate of that entity. And so logically speaking, saying that having existence would make something better than worse just like doesn't compute, right? It just doesn't work. It's kind of another interesting way to go. Okay, so there's the ontological proof. My favorite's done. Best for first. We'll do the cosmological proof next. Okay, so the original formulation of the cosmological proof comes to us from our main man, Aristotle, who isn't using it to prove, I mean, like, Jesus was not around yet, but nor was there any sort of like idea of the Abrahamic tradition in ancient Greece. So what Aristotle is doing in Metaphysics 2, I think, is where he gives his proof for the unmoved mover, is he says, look, for anything to like get started at all, there has to be like a first push, a first turn of the wheel, a mover that itself remains unmoved, which is a very early formulation of a kind of cosmological proof. It's also given to us by Aquinas, who was a giant of a man. He carried books that were as large as buildings in one hand and the building in the other. It's frightening in the Middle Ages how large people were able to be. Also Leibniz, with his beautiful wigged head of hair. He's one of my favorite philosophers. I wrote my my writing sample to get into graduate school was about Leibniz and the free will of God. So I love him. He just writes so beautifully, and his examples and metaphors are wonderful. In an era of philosophy like the Enlightenment period, where everybody's very stodgy and kind of boring, Leibniz keeps it fun. So he's a cool guy. Okay, so the cosmological proof, similar to the ontological proof, comes to us from the Greek cosmos, universe, and logos, principle of. So the principle of the universe is like what makes the cosmos. The cosmos is kind of like the thrust, the spirit of this argument. And it goes like this. So one, all things that exist must have a cause. So like this, my coffee mug exists. It was caused both to be here and at all insofar as it exists. There's a reason that it exists, and I can explain how it got here, right? Cause and effect, the principle of sufficient reason, our basic principle of scientific reasoning and thinking generally. The universe is a thing that exists. Here we are. Therefore, the universe must have a cause. But the only sort of thing that could have caused the universe is God. Therefore, God caused the universe, right? So the universe can't cause itself. The coffee cup doesn't just like spontaneously begin existing. It comes from something. And if the entirety of the universe is operative in under the scope of natural law, which requires cause and effect, like the coffee cup is, then it too must have a cause, but it can't spontaneously exist, come into existence itself. It must have some sort of reason that caused it. Now, if something is to cause the entire universe to exist, but it can't be the universe itself, it must be some being, entity separate from. Therefore, something like that caused the universe to exist. And again, it's deductive. So here's a logical proof I threw together. What's wrong with the argument? How do we object to this one?
What caused God?
Yeah, good question. Yeah. Where do I have that one? So, okay. One, oh yeah, here it is. It's the turtles all the way down. So we could deny premise 4 that the only sort of thing that could cause the universe is God, right? This would be like the turtles all the way down thing, that like what caused the coffee cup to be here? Well, what's the coffee cup resting on? Well, this table. What's the table resting on? The floor. What's the floor resting on? The ground. What's the ground resting on? The earth. What's the earth resting on? The universe. What's the universe resting on? The back of a great turtle. What's that turtle resting on? It's turtles all the way down, right? So you might get this sort of reductio ad absurdum for a cosmological proof. And this is why Aristotle intimated that the first turn of like the wheel of existence must have been turned by something that itself remained unmoved. And that the only sort of thing like that is what we conceive of in our religious traditions as being like God. Now, that might be a little spooky and strange, but I mean, it already kind of is. You roll back time all the way to the beginning and who knows what the heck. Now, another worry that we might have, if it's not what caused God, is why think God at all, right? So I might be like a perfect believer of the Christian God. In fact, let's do it the other way around. I might be a perfect atheist, right? I might like think that there is no God, but I might also agree with the proof, right? Like I think that the whole like Abrahamic tradition of God is totally absurd, but I still think that something must have caused the universe, right? So this proof doesn't commit us to the existence of the God of theology, right? It gives us only a God or a being or some force, whatever, right? That like minimally restrictive conclusion, in that it only says that there is such a thing that is separate from the universe and caused it to be like be in existence. right? What else? Any other objections to this one? So again, strategies for playing this game. Look at the premises. Each one I've marked has a premise. Do you agree with it? And if you don't, why not? Right. And then you can also look at the inferences, the 1 and 2, holding together two different premises. We might think, well, no, the inference doesn't come from those premises because there's some like wedge, which would be your intuition about why the inference itself is wrong. So it's just like strategic ways of working through.
Not everything really does have a cause, though.
Not everything has a cause. What sort of thing doesn't have a cause?
I was gonna say the exact same thing. I would like fundamental constants of the universe or the laws of physics themselves
Mhm.
are kind of they could be considered like arbitrary if you think about it.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, there's the universe, and then there's the metaphysical set of principles, which are, depends who you ask. When we do our embodiment section, we learn from Heidegger, we might learn that it's existence that precedes essence, which is the famous injunction of the existentialists, which I'll be teaching this summer if you guys want to take that class. So if existence precedes essence, then it is from the existence of the universe that we are able to derive natural law at all. But if essence precedes existence, which, like all our Enlightenment philosophers here seem to think, then there is some strange, spooky metaphysical set of laws that exist, but are functionally, operatively, and ontologically, right? They're the form of being is something very different from the form of being of nature itself. And we might think that those laws of nature are, though the law itself says that all things that exist must have a cause, that law is not contained within the domain of itself, right? So it's like a rule that doesn't exist within the domain that like objects that must follow the rule, are in. James, did you have other thoughts about things that without causes? No. Yeah, good. So we might think that there are things like natural laws. Sometimes people bring up the quantum physics stuff, but there's this famous experiment where they push two plates really close together, and they see like little particles popping in and out of existence. I tend to think that that's just imprecise measurements, rather than particles popping in and out of existence. We just like can't see where they're going or what's happening to them. But that's another sort of popular response there. Good. And I just talked about this, that the argument doesn't commit us to like, the God who said to Job, like, sorry, I'm God, so I did this because I want to, or because I can, I suppose is more the idea. It's not that God that this argument proves. It's not even like the triomniperfect God. The ontological proof at least gave us the triomniperfect God, which is presumably the same sort of God that is in our religious traditions. But this God is not. It's just another sort of convenient crossover between the two kinds. Okay, so we talked enough about that. Okay, so the teleological proof. So we're going to move away from these deductive, given the laws of reason and of inference. We're still using reason and inference, but we're going to move on from just like an internal reconstruction of principles of reason to an external examination of the world, and show that from this external examination, we can still derive a proof for God's existence through the teleological proof. Okay, so this comes to us originally from William Paley, good old Bill Paley. And we've talked a little bit about telos in the virtue ethics lecture, the telos being the end, that for the sake of which. It's sort of like the future exists, like fate existence, like pulling us into it, right? That Michelangelo both saw the form of the David in the marble, and the marble, like, you know, like almost solicited him to carve the David into it. It was always meant to be that way. So same idea here, that given the teleological structure of nature, if nature does have a teleological structure, we can see from that teleological structure it being organized in a way that has a purpose, right? A fate, a way that it must be, a harmonic principle, that harmonic principle is placed in nature. At least we can reason so inductively. Okay, so here's the quote from Paley. In crossing a heath, suppose I pitched my foot against a stone and were asked how the stone came to be there. I might possibly answer that for anything I knew to the contrary, it had lain there forever, nor would it perhaps be easy to show the absurdity of this answer. But suppose I had found a watch upon the ground, and it should be inquired how the watch happened to be in that place. I should hardly think of the answer I had before given, that for anything I knew, the watch might have always been there. There must have existed at some time and at some place or other an artificer or artificers who formed the watch for the purpose which we find it actually to answer, who comprehended its construction and designed its use. Every indication of contrivance, every manifestation of design which existed in the watch exists in works of nature, with a difference on the side of nature of being greater or more, and that in a degree which exceeds all computation. Okay, so does anybody recognize what this is an argument for? No? You ever hear of intelligent design? Yeah, this is like the argument for intelligent design. And though it may not be an appropriately placed lesson in a science class, it's at least a well-formed argument in its own right and worth contending with. So subtract politics away. Let's look at that argument, which is all here, by the way. We can extract the argument from this quote here. So 1, entity E within nature, so it's like a rock or whatever, is like a specified human artifact, a machine like a watch, in relevant respects R. So we can say that there is some property that is shared by natural objects and human objects, is what this is saying. So A, the human artifact, has this property that makes it like natural artifacts, precisely because it's a product of deliberate design by intelligent human agency. And like effects typically have like causes, right? So if I spit on the ground and it makes the ground wet, and then I do it again, I'm probably all right to infer that the ground is wet in the second place that I spat, right? That like the cause has reoccurred and the effect is likely to like be the same. Therefore, it's highly probable that the entity within nature, the natural object, has R, the relation that makes it like be similar to an intelligently designed object, precisely because it too is a product of deliberate design by intelligent, relevantly human-like agency. So we should notice that it has to do with high probability. This isn't saying like God exists. It's saying like it's probable that God exists. So here, let's give a better example. This is kind of like a complex formulation. So a watch has all sorts of gears that are intricately placed together, right? It has a certain function, it ticks, it needs to be shook up to be used, or have a battery, or both. And if we find a watch on the ground, we don't think like we might find a rock that it was just always there. We think that it must have been put there and it must have been made at some point. So what Paley is saying is like, look, the rock is actually quite a lot like the watch. When we look outside and we see the very specific way that nature operates in its niches and in its ecohabitats and all that, we can see an equilibrium, an interconnectedness of natural objects with one another. That Darwin's finches all have different sized beaks because on their different islands they have different holes and prey that they're going after, but they're all pretty similar. They're all finches, right? And they're designed just so because the beak is made just so to fit within the hole that is just so long to get the worm that feeds it, right? And when we look at, say, like the structure of plants, one of my favorite examples is a South African orchid that that resembles, I think is probably the best word for it, female wasps of a certain species, like one species. And it also produces the pheromones of those wasps in like heat or whatever, right? So the male wasps will, in their, like drive to reproduce, land upon the orchid and, like have their good time with the orchid and then fly away with its pollen, land on the next orchid and pollinate the population of flowers, right? Now, that looks a lot, at least in like from Paley's perspective, this looks a lot like the watch. Really intricate gears that fit together so specifically and perfectly so as to turn one another and fit a certain function, right? That the shape of the orchid, the specific pheromone that is the same pheromone as the female wasp itself, that it all just fits together, right? And we see the ecosystem working. So it turns out that there's this property of, given that like effects have like causes, and the effect of the harmonic unity of our natural environment, like these orchids and their wasps, is analogous to the harmony of the specific gears that were intelligently placed within the watch to make it tick time, right? Therefore, given that it's like probable, it's just as probable that that watch was placed there by someone or dropped or whatever, it was made intelligently. It's just as probable that nature is the very same. Right? So we have sort of an analogy between human artifacts and natural objects. And that analogy is held together by this principle of similarity, and that given our cause and effect sort of reasoning, we can see that that principle of similarity gives us good reason, high probability to think that intelligent design persists through both. There's your intelligent design argument. What's wrong with it?
I guess you could use evolution and natural selection just as an argument against it, that those kind of relationships can form just by the fact that, that flower just happened to evolve in the way over time, over long spans of time, where it just found that right pheromone that worked perfectly, or that right color pattern in some mutation that just happened to fit that way. So then over billions of years, to us looking at it now, it kind of looks like, oh, this must have been intelligently designed, but
Good.
not necessarily.
Yeah, so this is maybe one way of relating this objection to the argument is to say that the analogy Paley makes between the human and human artifacts and natural objects, that analogy is an equivocation, right? That like effects don't have like causes, and that we limit ourselves in thinking clearly about what's actually going on when we stop at similarity, right? So bats have wings and birds have wings, but it's convergent evolution. They have completely different genetic lineages, and it's just like an accident that they both like grew wings and are able to fly. And we might think that this is an intelligent design and like, look, there's wings in both cases, but they're completely different kinds of wings. It's like it's a fact of our like simple-mindedness that we have the same word for these like physical structures, and that the principles of evolution in selecting pressures through natural selection and the fitness of different mutated traits over the course of tens of thousands of years are accidental, right? Everything is just sort of accidentally pressuring each other, and we look at the world and we construe it as like kind of fitting together, but it's all just a big mess of chaos, right? Always changing, and it only barely works, right? It's stumbling forwards. But that's not like the watch. The watch is a very deliberate, designed, formal object that is intelligently put together. It's not chaotically put together. And so to say that the like effect, which is the fact that like nature works and the watch works, has a like cause in intelligent design, is to equivocate through analogy the natural object with the human artifact, because the human artifact does not have a like cause, or sorry, the human artifact does not have a like cause because the natural object is a force of natural selection and randomness. It's a stochastic system. It's not an intelligent system. Good. Yeah.
I actually have an analogy for this.
Okay.
So let's just say I made a machine, right? That just randomly assembled watches in different ways, just like put random gears about inside the watch, and I had the machine make thousands, and every time I looked at the watch, if it didn't work, I would continuously change the machine over and over and over again until the watch ticked, until the watch functioned. How would you be able to know whether I just intelligently made that watch that just happened to work after all those different watches that didn't work, or if I just put it together myself? You know what I mean?
Yeah, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference that
Mhm.
by the object itself. And this is just a good reason to think that like nature isn't teleological. Not that nature isn't teleological, but this is like one good reason to think that it might not be, is that this is like a very Humean sort of thought, right? Is that just by looking at the object itself, you cannot infer a teleological principle or cause for the sake of which you only get the object, right? You don't get that other stuff in it, right? You don't have its causal history, right? Just like with people, right? You see a person and you don't have their past just from what they present to you in like that moment. And yet we infer all sorts of things about each other based on like just like face value judgments. And that's just, it's uncritical and simple thinking. And like in a lot of cases, it's a necessity, right? We can't just like think through everything all the time, but at least it's just another way of saying like, look, the object itself does not have its history in it. So good. Yeah, this is a nice objection. That just as Hume would say, look, I don't ever see myself anywhere I look. I only see impressions of myself. Similarly, we might say, look, I see nature everywhere, but I don't see a principle of nature. I just see like, tree and flower and grass and all that, don't see where they came from. Good. Yeah, Rachel.
So I think this might come together as I'm saying it.
Okay.
I can't fully get it, but if there's parallels between things that kind of are proofs for each other, like the wing example, that seems to be pointing at a distinction without a difference, because that there are a distinction between the bat wing and the bird wing, but they're in their essence, they provide the same thing. But then if that's true for like the grander design, there's either a distinction without a difference between us and God, or there is no difference, which proves that the proof doesn't make sense because these are all just distinctions with major differences.
Do the part with us and God again. Like, can you?
So I guess
I didn't follow
God
that
would
part.
also, there'd have to be some parallel there too. Because what in our summation would be, if everything has a parallel, and that's what this is, definitively is.
Oh, you mean like God's intelligence and our intelligence
are either also parallel,
Yeah.
which means there's no distinction between us
Yeah.
and God, there's no difference, which proves that God doesn't exist because it's essentially the same thing, or that we're God, or there is a distinction with a difference, which means that the fundamental argument of these parallels being true also can't be foundational.
Good. So this is a cool objection too. So let me see if I can spit it back. So the idea is that the teleological proof, as said here, is it turns upon the idea of intelligent design, right? That human objects like a watch artifact and natural objects like the rock both share what are supposed to be like causes, which is in intelligent design. And we know that the watch has this property of intelligent design and it fits and works together. And we look at nature and we say, look, it fits and works together too, and it's intelligent design, but no human could like design that, right? So we might think that, again, there's a form of equivocation between intelligent design qua human and intelligent design qua God, and that the analogy breaks down there, that the intelligence that would be required to design nature is so completely foreign to the kind of intelligence designed through the watch, and that we don't have any principle, given what the argument has provided for us. We don't have any principle to draw that analogy between human intelligence and God-like intelligence, as we do between the objects, right? We can say like, look, the objects themselves might be analogous, but why should we think that, like, given some like sort of empirical argument, look, that like stuff fits together. I gave you the story about the orchid and the wasp, but I don't have any stories to tell about, you know, God's intelligence. In fact, the only story I could tell is that God's probably omniscient if God exists, and I'm not, right? So there's a disanalogy right there. Cool. So nice objection. I like that.
You can make an argument for the opposite of this. You could be like, oh, well, life is just so complex and so sophisticated that, you know, it's impossible that there'd be this super intelligent thing that would just know how to do all this stuff, you know? And so you could make the argument that it's more likely that just chaotic randomness made it instead, because of just how many chances there were for the randomness to make that, you know what I mean?
Yeah, sure. Like when you put headphones, bring back the headphone jack hashtag. When you put headphones in your pocket, you know why they always get tangled? Does anybody know?
Due to like the it's like a no, not the magnets, but it's like I lost it. I thought I knew, but I guess
There might be mechanical explanations. That's not what I'm a philosopher. That's not what I'm going to give you. I'm not an engineer. The actual reason is due to probability. There's only one way in which the headphone cord remains straight, right? And infinitely many other ways in which it gets all messed up in itself. And so as it moves around, it's much more likely to get all messed up in itself than to remain straight. It's one of infinitely many possible situations. So just as James is saying, like, look, we're looking at a form of nature that is straight, but in a stochastic system where all possibility is available, that this might just be the one where it worked and we got lucky. Good. Okay, cool thoughts. So Hume denies the first premise, and he does this like disanalogy stuff that we've tried in a couple different ways. The way Hume does it, it says, look, like natural objects are not like human artifacts. Just like rocks are not like watches. Like living things and non-living things and all that. So he breaks down the analogy there, but we've done it a couple different ways. So we'll just move on. Okay, so we've proved God's existence 3 ways. We've looked at objections. And these are all sort of like rational proofs. But what if we give something other than a proof, right? We're not looking to prove God, to commit a belief in God given some principle of reason or deduction or induction, as it might happen, but rather to bet on God, that we're better off, right? It's not a matter of deductive reasoning, but a matter of practical reasoning that we have belief or faith in God's existence. And this comes to us from Pascal. Is anybody, by the way, before I go into this, have anybody heard of Pascal's wager? It's kind of famous. No?
Wait, yeah.
Yeah.
Catholic school.
Yeah. That'll do it to you. All right. So here's Pascal. Pascal's a pretty cool guy. He had one of his friends go up to the top of a mountain with some barometric tools to prove that there was less oxygen up there, right? That the atmosphere sort of spreads out. He was also like a bohemian gambler and mathematician who invented probability theory to make more money gambling, and then got kind of bored because he gamed the system and beat it, and so turned his mathematical mind to the higher, more contemplative practices like philosophy. So before we do Pascal, I'm going to teach you a little bit about expected utility. We're going to do some rational choice theory, which we've looked at a little bit with utilitarianism. So the expected utility is just a predicted utility value for one of several outcomes. Like with utilitarianism, you're trying to find what gives you the most benefit and the least harm. That's your expected utility. And you calculate your outcomes based on actions and consequences. So the principle of instrumental rationality is just that if a person has a goal G and believes that doing A is the best way of achieving G, then the person will do A. This principle is your primary principle of formal economics. And it's totally absurd because people don't think like this, but this is how economists typically conceive of the human mind to make their graphs about human behavior. I think it's silly, but rational choice theory is just a reconstruction of this principle. It's to say that we collapse goals into beliefs and preferences. What do we prefer and what do we think about the world? We order our preferences by assigning utilities, and then we reformulate instrumental rationality as a person will choose the action that maximizes utility given their preferences. So if, for instance, I have a 50% chance of winning $200 or a 1% chance of winning $7,000, and I want to maximize utility, I prefer more money than less, right? What am I going to do? Well, the expected utility of the first bet is 100, right? So you just divide 200 by 0.5, right? So if say like I'm betting, then I'm going to choose the first bet over the second bet because the expected utility of the second bet is lower, right? And if I did the bet like an iterative number of times, like a whole lot, I would get more money from the first bet than I would from the second bet, just, you know, at odds. If I'm the house, then I want to sell people the second bet because I make more of my money back. We can also combine preferences here. So this is just to show like we use math to say what people want and how they will choose what they want. So consider acts with possible consequences. I have an act A and two consequences of A. So I can, why is it always like something terrible that is the example? Like imagine I murder somebody and one consequence is I don't get caught and one consequence is I do. There are utilities to getting caught, which is bad. And there's utilities to not getting caught, which is also bad, but maybe not quite as bad as getting caught for, you know, Socrates would say it's worse just to do it at all. Doesn't matter if you get caught because you harm yourself and you harm others, but Socrates aside. There are certain probabilities of outcomes. So each consequence being like getting caught or not has a certain probability. So, you know, if you like commit the crime in the middle of the daytime in a public place, like you get arrested like that. The probability of being arrested is like 99.9999%, right? As opposed to not, which is, you know, the other like 0.0001% of not. So the expected value of A is just taking these consequences and multiplying them by the probability that they occur, and then the utility that you get from them. So the expected value that you get is just the sum of the products of probabilities and utilities of an act. Okay, so here's an example. A lottery ticket has, a lottery has 100 tickets and just one winning ticket with a prize of $90. What is the expected value of buying a ticket for $1? So the consequence, one, is that you win, and your utility of winning is $90, right? Like you win the lottery, and your probability, like the chance that you win, is 0.01. There's 100 tickets, right? So there's 1% chance that you win. Consequence two, however, is that your ticket is not drawn. You lose $1, right? So -1 utility if we're just assigning dollar values to utilities. And the probability of this consequence occurring is 0.99, 99%. So what's the expected utility of making this choice of betting? So we multiply our probabilities and our consequences out, and we find out that making this bet yields us a -0.1 expected utility, or negative 10 cents. So if we're the house, we want people to buy into this bet because we're selling a lot of it, and we make on average, law of big numbers over the course of time, we make 10 cents every time, or per bet. And so we net gain it. People game the world this way, like with sweepstakes and stuff, with like lottery machines that appear in bars here and there. Like what companies will do is they'll evaluate the expected utilities wrong, and people find this out. They can find that there is like a positive net utility to playing the game, and so they just bet a ton of money into it, and they make back a ton of money, and they do the sit. They get to be the house in these cases. Okay, so back to Pascal. Pascal is doing just this. In fact, he invents this kind of rational thinking about whether or not to take bets given the expected utility of the outcomes weighed against one another. So what Pascal says in his famous wager, God is or he is not, setting up the possibility space, consequence 1 and 2. But to which side shall we incline? Reason cannot decide anything here. There is an infinite chaos which separated us. A game is being played at the extremity of this infinite distance where heads or tails will turn up. Which will you choose then? Let us see. Since you must choose, let us see which interests you least. You have 2 things to lose, the true and the good, and 2 things to stake, your reason and your will, your knowledge and your happiness. And your nature has 2 things to shun, error and misery. Your reason is no more shocked in choosing one rather than the other, since you must of necessity choose. Is he or is he not? But your happiness. Let us weigh the gain and the loss in wagering that God is. If you gain all. If you lose nothing. Wager then, without hesitation, that he is. Kind of cool, a super epic, badass philosophy that nobody writes today. But Pascal was a badass. So we can break down this paragraph into a probability calculus. So we have acts A and B, choose to believe or not, and states of affairs X and Y, which we'll just assign as like God exists and God doesn't exist. Okay. So, and then there's going to be certain utilities for each of these possible choices given possible outcomes. And this setup is invented by Pascal. So Pascal's partition is A, believe that he is not, be an atheist, or B, act as a believer, believe that God exists, right? A and B are 2 possible choices. And there are 2 possible states of affairs, or as we called them earlier, consequences. Either God exists or God doesn't exist, right? So how do we fill out the probabilities? How do we assign utilities and probabilities to God's existence, right? It was easy to do with the bet, right? Because there's 100 tickets and you only have 1 of them. And so you know that your chance of winning is 0.01, 1%. But how do we fill out probabilities for God's existence? Well, this is a belief chart. We're going to assume perfect agnosticism, that it's equally likely that God exists as God doesn't exist, right? If you have more evidence to think that God doesn't exist, you might fall more towards the atheistic quadrant. If you have more reason to believe that God does exist, the theistic ones. But we're going to assume perfect agnosticism for the sake of the setup, and assume that there is an equal probability of God existing or not, 50-50, right? It's a coin toss, as Pascal does. Pascal says, look, he is or he is not, and it's a coin toss that has our eternal fate in its flipping grip. So how do we assign utilities? So we have probability now. How do we assign utilities to the different outcomes? Well, from Mark 16:16, he that believeth and is baptized shall be saved, but he that believeth not shall be damned. And so failing to believe in God, given this quote from the Bible, should God exist, results in a terrible penalty. If you're an atheist and God exists, you're damned. And you don't want to be damned. It's not a fun time forever. So we'll assume that the utility of being an atheist, given God's existence, is negative infinity. You suffer forever, incalculably suffer forever. Negative infinity utility. It's real bad for you. You just don't want that. But he that believeth and God exists shall be saved. You die, you go to heaven, you have the beatific vision, you get to pet your childhood puppy, grandma says hello and you feel real great forever. So if God exists and you believe in God, then good for you. You won the bet. So we'll assume that the utility of believing in God and God existing is infinity. That we'll assume that this is enough to like get you into heaven just for the sake of the construction. I should say this is kind of a divergence, so don't lose the train of thought here, but it's like common, it's always an objection that people bring up, that because I forget to say it, but Pascal didn't think that his wager was enough to like give you true belief and like satisfy the get infinite utility and go to heaven, but it's like a first step, right? So for Pascal, we make the wager and then we live in the faith, and eventually it like it naturally grows in us like one of Mung's sprouts or something. So like he recognizes that a wager is not enough to like give you true conviction that counts as the right sort of requisite faith to be properly religious, but forget about that for now. So we'll just assume that belief in God and God's existence gives you infinite utility. Okay, so we have our utilities and our probabilities assigned here. For the sake of filling out our probability chart, let's say God doesn't exist, right? We just had that Mark quote to give us like the utilities of God if God exists. So if God doesn't exist, let's assume that you're an atheist. We're assuming we're in Pascal's time when everybody believed in God, and like to be a part of the church was to be a part of community, and to be not a part of the church was to be ostracized and like a weirdo outsider. So assume that there's just no utility to not believing in God and God not existing. Like you die, nothing happens, whatever. But we'll also assume that believing in God and God not existing, well, you still got to take part in the church, and you got maybe some alms when you needed it, or you had some nice advice from a clergyman, or whatever. Like you get 1,000 utility. It seems like a lot of utility, but we'll assume that you got 1,000 utility just for being a part of like civilized church-going society during Pascal's time. Okay, so in this expected utility theory, there's this idea of a dominance rule. So the dominance rule states that if at least one state of affairs always has more utility and never has less utility than any other state of affairs, that act dominates the others, right? We don't even need to like weigh the balance, because there's only one option that gives you the most utility and never has less utility. So it's just always the ideal way to go, right? And in this case, belief dominates, right? Because believing in God always has more utility if God exists or if God doesn't exist. 1,000 is more than 0, and infinity is more than negative infinity, right? And it never has less, right? So choose that he is, right? Set your heart on faith. Okay, so now we'll change the case. Let's say that you're an atheist, and like maybe in today's material world of the nons, as the religious people call them, the people who don't identify with religion, they're like, the power of the church is not what it was in Pascal's day, and you don't really need to go to church every Sunday to be a part of society. And that if you're an atheist and God doesn't exist, that you didn't spend your time on Sundays going to church. Instead, you spent them studying for med school, and you become a big famous doctor and cure cancer, right? So 1,000 utility for you. You didn't waste those Sunday afternoons and mornings. You spent them studying, and it turned out God didn't exist. So good for you, 1,000 utility. But let's also say that if you do believe in God and God doesn't exist, that you did spend that time on Sundays, and you could have been a doctor and you could have cured cancer, and you didn't really spend your time very well. So negative 500 utility. It's not so great for you that you believed in God and God doesn't exist. So what we've done here is we've told a different story about the utility of these different outcomes to shift around the numbers associated with our calculation. And in doing so, no belief dominates, right? So there's not one action, A or B, in which there's always more and never less, right? Because in the case of God not existing and you believing, you have less utility. Okay. So now we have to do our calculation, our expected utility calculus. We have to weigh the outcomes and probabilities against one another to find out what we should do. So the expected utility of believing is 0.5 times infinity, right? Because we're assuming perfect agnosticism, plus 0.5 times negative 500. So we're looking at this bottom row here, and that will give us an expected utility of infinity for believing, right? That half of negative 500 is negative 250, but what's negative 250 times or plus infinity? It's just infinity still, right? But the expected utility of not believing is the same kind of calculation, which ends up in negative infinity. So even though there's not one choice, belief or not, that dominates, we're still better off, given rational choice theory, to believe anyways. So regardless of how we fill in the utilities for non-belief in God, Pascal says, look, it's straightforward. Believe in God, you're better off no matter what you do. It's the right bet to make. Flip the coin and bet that he is. What do you think? What does Vegas have to say? Are we putting our chips on the table? I can force it. Who's betting that God exists? Who's not betting that God exists? And I see that we have some perfect agnostics still. Fair enough. If you're betting that God exists, is it because of this? Does this convince you? No. Why not?
I mean, I think I'm just like an unbiased opinion. I mean, I don't know. I just study the Bible and I do what it says and I see results. So I don't know. I've never really used this type of expected utility because I just have the Bible. It just tells me what to do. It tells who I am in like such a deep way that nothing could ever explain that. So I guess I'm just unbiased or a biased opinion on this.
I wouldn't call that biased. I would say that it's just a different form of calculation, and that the one form of calculation is incommensurate with the other. Yeah, that's good. Thank you for sharing. What about not betting then? This looks like a good reason. This is math. Who can say no to math?
If God exists, but there is no punishment.
What if God exists, but there is no punishment? I'll talk about that in a moment. I put a pin in that thought.
Well, I disagree with the premise, kind of where they were going. But also, if it's just belief, then demons and the devil would also be saved. Like, it seems like it goes against itself almost in a way.
Okay.
But that is predicated on like a heavily religious,
Yeah.
not so much the actual proof itself.
Yeah. Okay, so let's take the idea of demons and devils existing and James's idea of there being different assignments of utility for non-belief that may not be negative infinity, and then mush them together. Okay, so like half of each idea here, and then we get like the full complete objection that I've prepared for, which is called the many gods problem. So Pascal assumes that there are only two choices, belief and non-belief, right? There are only two outcomes. You go to hell or you don't. You go to heaven, right? But this isn't strictly true. Like, we can imagine a possible world in which there are more outcomes and more choices, right? And so this would require us to make this calculation a little more complicated. Okay, so the whole practical argument rests upon the existence or non-existence of a Christian God for Pascal, which, you know, like fair to Pascal, makes sense. He's the product of his times, and that's like the dominant way of thinking or not, right? That this is the debate. And so he speaks to his people, right? The people of his period, speaks their language and is a part of their conversation. But we in the future, we can reflect upon these arguments and find where they shift and move despite the conversation that was. So what if other gods can exist as well, like other demons perhaps? If so, then our practical reasoning choices must change. So here is a very dapper, dandy, in fact, looking demon with a funny hat. So imagine that there's not only the possibility of the all good Christian God exists, right? The tri-omniperfect God, but that another God may also exist amongst the many pantheons and sects of gods postulated by the multitude of world religions. We're only interested in the possible existence of this particular God. This God is an evil trickster who condemns sloppy practical reasoning. He is spiteful and full of wrath. When believers are deceived and rely on their poor and meager personal interests to infer the rational choice theory, that the almighty and good God exists, our spiteful trickster is beset with anger. He despises those who forsake and forget him. Those who believe in the Christian God are punished. Yet those who are made agnostic do not commit such a terrible crime for our trickster and may yet go to heaven. You don't need to believe in the trickster. It's better if you don't believe in something other than the trickster for this guy. So with only one God, this is what our chart looks like. But according to the many gods objection, our chart has to change, right? So Pascal's partitions must change too. All of a sudden, we have 3 choices and 3 outcomes. So we can act as an atheist. We can act as a believer in God, or we can act as an agnostic. So in the case that we believe in God and God exists, great, you go to heaven. But the trickster God is unhappy. If the trickster God exists and you believe in the Christian God, he sends you to hell because you were being sloppy with your practical reasoning. And if no God exists and you believed in God, then you spent all of your Sundays at church when you could have been studying for the med school exams or whatever. Okay, so in the case that you are an agnostic and God exists, straight to hell, game over. That's the end for you. If you are an agnostic and the trickster God exists, then you get rewarded potentially. At least it's not straight to hell. And if you're an agnostic and no God exists, then you spent your time out of church on Sunday. But if you're an atheist and either trickster or normal God exists, straight to hell, and maybe you didn't even think about whether or not God existed, like the agnostic mind is the atheist, just like you're not worried about it. And so you have more brain power for your med school cancer curing options, right? So if we change the idea of the existence or non-existence of God to the possibility of alternative deities being a part of our expected utility calculus, and we shift the utilities of the possible existence or non-existence of these different gods, then we get a very different kind of utility calculus, which does end up looking like an objection to Pascal. So nothing dominates here. There's no one choice that's better than the rest and never worse. And so we have to run a utility calculus again. So the expected utility of belief ends up being negative 100, right? Because the positive infinity and negative infinity cancel each other out. The expected utility of agnosticism ends up being 500, and of disbelief, negative infinity. So you don't want to be an atheist given this setup, but you also probably don't want to believe because you're better off remaining agnostic. So when we consider the notion of a jealous and spiteful trickster God, if this kind of God is possible, logically speaking, it doesn't have to actually be possible, but logical possibility should be enough for us to be worried if we're calculating outcomes, right? our answer to this problem is no longer so clear. It's not just a coin toss. No one utility dominates, and crucially, what we ought to do depends on the utilities assigned in that third column. So as we shift our utilities up and down, given what we think about the possible non-existence of God, this will tell us whether or not we should be a believer, agnostic, or, well, never atheist, but believer or agnostic. So this is like the objection to Pascal, right? So you just open up the possibility space. And I would ask you if you have questions. As you can see, I have a slide prepared for it, but we've been here for like an hour and a half, so let's go home. That was fun. So next week we will do, we'll read William Rowe, who is an atheist, was an atheist. He died recently, a few years ago. And he defends a position called friendly atheism, which I think is wonderful. He does it really well too. The idea is that as an atheist, you don't need to think that believers are irrational, that there is a way of accepting the alternative forms of belief, atheism or theism, but also respecting that there are rational principles that can substantiate both forms of belief. And he also talks about the problem of evil, which will be sort of like the main discussion of our lecture next week. So like we proved God's existence in several different ways next time, we're going to see the big argument against God's existence and how that gets dealt with by theologians and philosophers of religion through theodicy, telling a story that makes sense of the existence of God in tandem with the existence of evil. So there you go. See you next week.
Thank you.